Good morning, everybody. This is my friend Louise Fili. She's with us from New York City, Manhattan. And Louise, this is everybody. Everybody, this is Louise. This is our History of Graphic Design class. We are wrapping up our studies of Art Deco and Art Nouveau. And we've been looking at your lovely website and some of your portfolio work and talking about issues of style. Louise has authored or co-authored 22 books. She's a creative director, a graphic designer, and a typographic designer. We spoke briefly about the Mardel font. From 1978 to 1989, she was art director at Pantheon Books, where she designed nearly 2,000 book covers. And I've only heard about it, but she makes this paella, this squid ink paella, right? It's black.
It's black.
And it's delicious.
Favorite colors.
So one of these times when I come visit you, I'm going to be able to enjoy it. All right. Ladies and gentlemen, let's give a warm Minnesota welcome to Louise Fili.
Yeah.
Yep. Looks good.
There, we're in Italy.
Hooray.
So when I was 16 years old, I took my first trip to Italy with my parents, who were returning for the first time since they had left to come to America. Something I never, ever forgave them for. And it was here that I discovered typography like this that made me want to become a graphic designer. It prompted me to start collecting beautiful specimens of French and Italian letter forms that inspired me, starting with my art director job at Pantheon Books, where, well, you got the number already, 2,000 book jackets. So after that stint, I went on to open my own design firm, where I learned the two very important lessons of having your own business. One is that you should never depend on any one client or any one type of work. And secondly, that you should never sit and wait for the phone to ring with the perfect job. Because there is no perfect job. The perfect job is the one that you make for yourself. As a designer, you have to create your own personal projects, because it's really the only way that you'll grow and find your own design voice. So I started with what was closest to my heart, Italian Art Deco. And that's after I decided to keep my studio small and focus on the only three things that I'm interested in, which is food, type, and all things Italian. So it started with this book that I did with my husband, Stephen Heller, who you've probably heard of. And this led to a series that we did for Chronicle Books on Art Deco graphic design that did very well. These books were out for quite a while and eventually drifted into remainder purgatory. But then we came out with Euro Deco, which was a hardcover compendium of all the books. And then we did this inadvertent series, which we called the S series, that started with scripts, and then we did shadow type, stencil type, and slab type. So this is Italian Art Deco, which was the first book that became a series for Chronicle that I did with my husband, Stephen Heller. And, excuse me, okay. And these books sold very well, and then we put them into a compendium of a section of each of the books, and that was called Euro Deco. That was followed by what we called the S series, scripts, shadow types, and slabs. So together we've done over 20 books, and then I find other reasons to do books that will take me to Italy. So it started with Italianissimo, which is basically everything that we love and love to hate about Italy, mostly love, of course, like hand gestures. And this is the one reason why I could never live in Italy, fa della coda, which is the Italians in a formal line, which I think is illustrated quite well in this photograph. I did this little guidebook to artisan shops of Florence, where I got to taste test gelato all over the city, which was pretty great. And then I did this book. It's a monograph of my work. And doing a book of your work has got to be one of the most challenging things about being a designer. It felt like watching a bad movie trailer of my whole life flashing before my eyes. So while I was working on this, I made a vow that when I was finished, I would take a month off. And this is something I had never done before. I had only done once in my whole career, and that was 30 years before. So I can tell you one thing, every 30 years, it's a good idea to take a month off. Not for a vacation, of course. This was just so I could do another book. And on Italian signage, starting with those first few images I showed you, I had been taking pictures and documenting signs all over Italy, starting with 35mm slides, and then I graduated to point and shoot snapshots, and then finally digital. And these were only meant for my own reference and enjoyment. I had no interest in putting these into a book. But as the digital technology got better and better, I began to realize that I could put these into a book. Because at the same time, I was beginning to realize that all of these beautiful signs that I had assumed would be around forever were disappearing rate. Because I used to teach a typography workshop in Rome every year, and I would always take the students to look at the same favorite signs, and every year there would be one or two fewer from my list of greats. Like this one, which I think was one of the most wonderful ones in Rome. This was an art supply store, and this is a dimensional sign. So I went for a month to Rome, and brought along this very modest Google map to get started with. And I took my secret weapon, and no, this is not a selfie stick. This is a telescoping pole. I attached my camera to the top here, and I have a cable release that's attached to a piece of Velcro at the bottom. So this gave me what I'd always wanted in life, an extra 3 feet of height. And it was a much better way to photograph, and it attracted a lot less attention than a tripod did. So I had less trouble with guards. Like in this train station, this is the one train station in Rome, one of many, that happens to have this crazy futurist typography in blue. Nobody knows why, but it was in fact from the 30s. And I was always fascinated by it and had photographed it many times. But then I was talking to a friend in Rome once who said, yeah, but have you seen the mosaic typography inside? And I was like, what? Because of course I had never bought a train ticket and gone through the turnstile so I could get to the side that had this on the floor, which was pretty amazing. That's when I found out that in Rome, apparently they have a law that you can't photograph inside of a train station, but many of the other cities have not gotten that memo. And then what I would do when I got home at night, because I had to use every minute of my time to find more signs. When I would get home at night, I would sit in front of my laptop looking at Google Street View and going up and down every street, seeing if I could find any other interesting signs. So I knew I was going to be near the train station one day, so I was looking around and I found this great sign. And I, whenever possible, I tried to talk to the owners of these shops just to see what I could find out about the sign. And very, very often it was the grandson of the original owner, and which was the case here. This was opened in 1939, and he gave me this photograph of what the shop looked like when it first opened, which was pretty much exactly the same, except people were dressing a little more differently. And I asked him, I said, well, how did you choose this style of typography for the sign? Do you know? And he looked a little sheepish, and he just said, abbiamo rubato l'M da Mussolini. We stole the M and the N from Mussolini, and so they did. And this, I think, is the sexiest script in Rome. And this is a corner shop, so you get to see it twice, which is really fantastic. And I love this script, and I also love the angular script below it as well. And there's also, I asked if the owner was there, and of course he was there. It's the same thing in all these shops in Rome. It's always an octogenarian who's working there all day in the shop is always present when I ask for them. So I asked him a little bit about this. I asked him what year it was done, and he said, well, the vertical sign was done in the late 40s, but for the script sign, they had to wait because the tenants on the second floor had no interest in having their view blocked by a sign, no matter how beautiful it was. So I said, so what did you do? And he just kind of shrugged his shoulders, as only a Roman can. And he said, I bought the apartment. And so he did. And then I started traveling around. I went back to reshoot as much as possible because nothing was done digitally in the beginning, of course. And that's when I started to realize that every different town that I went to had its own style of signage. So this is a macelleria, which is a butcher shop. And you see this style of sign a lot in Florence, although I've never seen it anywhere else. And I love the way they managed to integrate the building number into the design also. And then, of course, there were times when the sign was no longer there, like this one. So what do? Photoshop. So the Florence train station that didn't get the memo. So, and that was fortunate because of typography. This station was built in 1929. It was very modern time, and it has this beautiful typography all over the inside of the station, although the outside has absolutely no typography on it at all, except the day that I was there, because it was right after Christmas, and they had this with this horrendous typography that we'd like to forget about. Then I went on to Bologna, and I had this is actually a spread from the book, because I had to put these three signs together, because these are three of my favorite signs, which was why whenever I go to Bologna, I always stay at the Albergo Orologio right here, this round green sign. Orologio means clock. And this is a nice little piazza where they don't allow cars, which makes it even better. And there were my three favorite signs, this Cappelleria, which at the time that I took this photograph still was selling hats, and Paganini, which is now a restaurant. And then the third one that was in the spread is no longer there. That used to be over here. So I would go on these trips and I would bring my own little handmade maps with me by neighborhood with the route figured out, because there was no time to lose. I couldn't get lost. I couldn't waste time not being able to find the sign right away. So I would take these maps with me, and I also relied on the negatives from my days. And to my own surprise, I still had the negatives for these. So this sign was this beautiful wrought iron sign, and I had no idea where it was, but I still had the negatives. So here they were. So we went from here to this nice ghost sign here. And then this sorbeteria, which I knew that I could find you, and I did. This is the picture I took of it. And I remember when I took this picture, I knew that it wasn't an old sign. I could tell by the drop shadow here, for example. And I knew I had seen this somewhere before. So when I came home, I looked through some of my books, and sure enough, they had ripped it off from this. So my book. How many of you have ever been to Venice? Thank you, Bill. Anybody else? Okay, and never gotten lost. Now, hands go down. So that's why they have these signs on the pavement in Venice, these mosaic signs that have the name of a trattoria or a hotel with an arrow that points to a hotel or restaurant that no longer exists. So this picture was taken the minute that I arrived. I had just stopped at the hotel, dropped off my bag, and I went right to find this sign to rephotograph it. And of course, some of it was missing, so we had to do a little Photoshop. But you can also see that it was rather filled back the next day with a box of baby wipes, and cleaned it up first before I could take the picture. And I was so happy to find this one because it fit the double page proportion of my book perfectly. This is a typical street sign in Venice, and by law, every building owner has to have the sign in this style, and they have to keep it in good condition, which means that this white rectangle has to be whitewashed every year. And then they pipe on, and they have to make sure that they do it right. God bless you. And these are called nizioletti, which is Venetian dialect for little sheets because of the white rectangles. And then if you take a ferry for about an hour to this little island called Murano, which is where they make lace, they have their own version of the nizioletti font. It's a lot more crude, and they also have this baffling number system for their building numbers. It took me the longest time to figure out what this was. Does anybody know? Bill, do you know?
1.
It's a 1. I finally figured it out just by process of elimination. I saw a sequence, and it was like, oh, because it was like 200, 20J, 202. So, yes, so that was interesting to find out. And this was one of my favorite, Lucca, which is a very beautiful town in Tuscany. And I was very lucky to have the opportunity to photograph this right after it had been cleaned, which difference. And a friend of mine was with me, so she was holding back this could get both of these little signs included in it. But the great thing about Lucca is that they have these beautiful signs. And even though this was for Osteria Biscotteria, a cookie and pastry shop, and it now sells running shoes, they don't mind having this sign there. Because I asked them in cities like this, and also in Torino, it's the same thing. I said, do you have the sign? And they said, no, but so why wouldn't we? And in this case, this is a beautiful Art Nouveau example. It's called Stile Liberty in Italian, for a bakery, which is still a bakery. And then Torino, as I just mentioned, has a lot of beautiful signage in both gold and brass. And these, how big would you expect these to be? They look like they're kind of small, like push plates, so it's about the size of your hand, but they're actually huge. And in fact, I had to take this picture to illustrate what was going on over my head when I was taking the picture of this. And also to give you an idea of how big those signs are. And what were they doing? They were replacing the third sign for this jewelry shop. So even before I had finished the Italian book, I was already thinking about the next one I should do, because I really felt this sense of urgency to record all of these signs before they were all gone forever. So this is Graphique de la Rue, which are the signs of Paris. And I figured this would be so much easier. It's just because Paris is just one city, not a whole country like Italy. And of course, Paris, with its refined sensibilities, will never stand for the removal of these typographic gems, right? Wrong. I have this in the back of the book. These are some before and afters. These were signs that I just thought would last forever. And this Tabac sign, I used to see every time I arrived in Paris, it would be there. Sometimes the awning was a different color, but it always had that beautiful script. And I went back and I couldn't find it. And then finally I realized that this was where it was, and this is what it looks like now, which is pretty sad. And Atlas was this beautiful Art Deco facade. Like you can see, it's not just the type, but the windows, everything was beautiful. And now they just have this generic type. I don't know how they could do that. And this, of course, was the greatest script M in the history of script, which is now this, which is barely even readable. So I went back with my pole and I always try to bring my Google map with as many places to start with as possible. And I would spend hours before I would leave particularly on these trips to Paris, just on Google Street View. If I knew I was going to be in a certain neighborhood, I would just go up and down every single street to see what else I could find. And I found a lot of interesting signs that way. And then I would make my own maps by arrondissement and draw in the routes so that I wouldn't waste any time. Because the weather is not so great in Paris. I was there, the first time I went there was over the Christmas holidays, where the days are short, it's low, and I can shoot all day. But I also took these with me, just with instructions like look up, so I would be sure not to miss anything. So this was my guide. And I was determined to photograph every boulangerie and patisserie sign that I could. And then a number of these, just like in Lucca or in Turin, sometimes they just keep the sign and they have a completely different kind of shop inside. And this one I found on Google Street View, and I thought this was really fantastic. But then when I went to look for it, I couldn't find it. And I didn't have the exact address because I was walking past this, and who would have noticed that there was something fantastic going on under this awning? So I had to go into the patisserie, and I bought an omelette croissant, and then I asked if by any chance they could open up the awning so I could take a picture. And they said that the owner wasn't kept to come back the next day. So I went back the next day, I ordered another almond croissant. I asked again, and they finally opened it up. So do this spread for the book. So this was all done in enamel, which is quite beautiful. And this is another boulangerie on the course. This is how it was treated for the book. A lot of Photoshop work. Samaritan was this beautiful department store from the 30s. And I was very lucky that I had the opportunity to photograph you see all of these signs here are what is shown here. And when I photographed this, the store had been closed for quite some time, and they were turning it into a mall with a co-op. And I was lucky that when I shot the Folies Bergère on this trip, they had just cleaned it, because the time before that, it looked like this, when California Dream Men was the main act.
And did you go? Check.
And then this is a billiards parlor. But the thing I love best about these trips is that is taking a wrong turn. And that's exactly how I found this sign, which I was just, my mouth dropped open when I saw it. This is a butter and store with this beautiful, typography. And there's even this nice typography down here that I almost didn't even see the first time. So I tried to focus on the neon scripts that were all disappearing, because apparently neon is very fragile and it only lasts 10 or 15 years, and then it has to be swapped out, and it's usually always for the worst. So I tried to photograph as much of the neon scripts as I could. This one, it took me a long time because it was this two-color, very neon kind of shade of pink. But it took me even longer to try to find this sign in the movie Breathless. I watched it over and over and over again, and I finally found that there was a second of when Jean-Paul Belmondo is standing on the street trying to find out where he can go hide, and you get to see Le Select for a moment. But I always wonder if there's a law in Paris that every hairdresser has to have a sign made out of a funky script, because it certainly seems that way. I became obsessed with all the coiffure signs. And deco hotel signs as well. And I also love looking at these to see, especially with the dimensional letters, to see when they screwed up, like, okay, what's wrong with this A? Does anybody know?
Backwards.
Thank you. It should be like this. The stress should be on this side, right? Yeah, you see lots of that. This I found on Google Street View, and this is just the post office, which I think is fantastic, especially that was my favorite. Oh, and there's more type down here too. I found this on Google Street View, and I love this type, even though it's a little funky, and that's a pretty crazy X, don't you think? And once again, the wrong A, but you gotta forgive them. So then what I would do, when I went back in August, I had the opposite problem. It was lots of hours of daylight, but too much sun, too many shadows. So morning, as soon as there was the first ray of light, and I would start shooting until about 10 in the morning, until it was too bright to really shoot anymore. Then I would just jump on any random bus, because I had a bus pass, and I would take pictures from the bus if I saw anything interesting, and that's how I came across these. And I went back and photographed these. And Printemps is the famous department store that's been around for quite a while, and they have this beautiful mosaic floor in the entrance. So the first time I went, there was way too much foot traffic, and I couldn't do anything. I decided to go back as soon as they opened the next morning. But of course, there was still a lot of foot. It was covering the corners like that. So while the guard wasn't looking, I just kicked the floor mats out of. Oh, so what if it's unstable? And finally got to this, but of course it was literally tiled together in Photoshop. Only in Paris would a public toilet be on the National Registry. That's what this is. This was a open, and I knew that it was in Place Madeleine, but this is Place Madeleine. It's a pretty big place, and I had to do a lot of searching on Street View, because I knew if I got there, I would be spending the whole day looking for it. So I just kept circling around, and if you look really carefully, you can see that there's some mosaics going on there. But what I especially like is that the mosaic artisan managed to put his name front and center. It's the first thing when you peer in. But I had to photograph this through the padlocked gate, which was not easy to do. This is another mosaic artisan, Edmond Coignet, who did the Palais Royal. And when I was doing a little research on him, I happened to find the cover of this catalog, and I saw the address of his studio, which was Rue de Londres. And I thought, gee, I was just there yesterday, photographing something that was mosaic. And it was Society of Mineral Waters, which was all done in mosaics. And it was next door to the building that Coignet had his studio in. So he must have been the one who did this. But I love how they have these here and the crowns with pearls, because it's source pearl. So I found this on Google Street View. This is right across the street from Père Lachaise, the famous cemetery. And I wasn't sure about the sign, but I thought I'd go check it out. So I got there, and it turned out the sign wasn't so great. And even worse, it was covered with mesh. So, but then I just happened to look down, and that is the best advice I think I can ever give you in life, is always look down, because do you see there's something down here? I didn't notice it when I did the screenshot from Street View, but when I got there, I realized I was standing on this, which is a pretty fantastic mosaic. Unfortunately, it was right in front of these automatic sliding glass doors. So as I was doing this in sections, the doors kept sliding open and closed, which was a little bit awkward, but they left me alone at least. And this is a nice deco sign for a jewelry shop, which I was lucky that I was walking on this side of the street and not this side, because you see this one is done in a much less interesting typeface. And I found this on Street View for, this is a poissonnerie, a fish shop. And I went to find out when this sign was made. And they kept boasting to me that this was the oldest fish shop in Paris. And I said, yes, but what about the sign? And they said, this is the oldest sign for the oldest fish shop in Paris. And I didn't really think this looked like it was from the 8th, but I couldn't argue with them. And this one was right next door. I think it was the same sign maker. Moulard is a very well-known Art Nouveau restaurant in Paris, which inexplicably has like this typical Art Nouveau type down here and very lack type here, but I love how it was arranged like this. Oops. And originally I wanted to shoot it like this, but I always had to remind myself that I couldn't expect to shoot everything the way you see it on Street View, because I couldn't stand in the middle of this very, very busy boulevard that this was on. So that was okay. And then of course there's a classic Parisian street sign, which is done on a number of older ones. This is a little bit newer in sans serif. And then there are some mosaic signs, which took a lot of work to try to locate, like this one for Boulevard Saint-Germain, which is like saying it's on Fifth Avenue. I had to go up and down the entire boulevard, and these tend to be higher up than normal street signs, but and there it is, worth the search. And then there was this one that I had to try to find. Oh, this part of what I'm showing you today, I presented to Google after my Barcelona book came out, because I was trying to convince them to bankroll my next endeavor, but they didn't seem to get it. This was very interesting because there are only 2 street signs left in Paris that are in this style, and you could see once again that happens a lot when it's dimensional letters, because they just glue them on backwards. But it turned out that I was staying in an apartment right on this street. So the first day that I got there, I saw it and I thought, oh, I better shoot this right away. But there was a branch in the way, so I had to come back with my nail scissors to cut it off. But look, I find that when I do these books, and I said, there's a sense of urgency, there's also the sense that I better shoot it immediately, because you never know what's going to happen. And sure enough, the next day, it was gone. It had just disappeared. And you can see that this was not easy to remove, right? And why would anybody remove this sign? But it was gone. So good, I got it when I got it. I saw this from the bus, and then I went back and re-photographed it. The last chapter of the book is called Sans mots, or Without Words, because Paris sells at that. So every block has an optique with some version of eyeglasses, or this for a scissor and knife store. And a lot of this started when, way back when there was an illiterate public that had to be able to decipher what the signage was all about. But there sure are a lot of different kinds of eyeglasses out there. Like these that look like they were done with a Sharpie. And of course, I love this shoe. Then these restaurants like to do anthropomorphic imagery. So this is Au Pied du Cochon. And this is Le Chien qui Fut, the smoking dog, which inspired me to do a logo recently for a a rotisserie chicken place in New York, Poulet sans tête, which is chicken without a head. And they actually made a blinking neon sign for it. So finally, I figured I could do one more of these books. So it had to be Barcelona, which was, I think, the best of all of them. So this is the book. So I decided, I did my sign map, and I had quite a few signs to get started with, but I was determined to find an Airbnb that was really centrally located right here. So I went on Airbnb, and nothing was coming up that was quite as central as I wanted it to be. But then I saw that there were some dots that were on the map, but they weren't coming up. So I clicked on one of them, and it said attic in Passage de Grazia, and I thought, what could that possibly be? So I clicked on it, and it was this fabulous penthouse on a really great avenue. And it was a little bit of a lost in translation issue, I guess. And it was available because who wanted to be in an attic? So it was really great because I could walk everywhere. And this was my map. I had 13 different neighborhoods to cover in 3 weeks. And the great thing about Barcelona is that the weather in December is perfect. And it's never too cold, it never rains. So, and what I found in Barcelona is that it's not just the typography, it's also the whole facade in general is really incredible. Like this mosaic and stained glass chocolate shop. El Indio had been open since the 1800s and closed just before I got there. This sign I photographed, and a couple of weeks later it was removed. So I really had to work quickly on this one. And Fotos Lopez is one that I had been really looking forward to seeing in person. I had seen it in a book, and I had been checking regularly on Google Street View. And when I got to Barcelona, I literally ran to the location because I couldn't wait to see the sign. And this is what I found. That's what I said. I was devastated. I felt like I had missed the removal of the sign by a matter of minutes, and I probably had. So the next day, I was interviewed by a reporter from El País, the Spanish newspaper, and I didn't even want to talk to him. I was still so upset about the sign. I can't even remember, but he must have asked me the name of the place and where it was. So the article came out the next day, and he in turn mentioned my disappointment. And a week later, I was back in New York, and I got an email from the grandson of the original founder of the photo studio, who said, my family and I were very moved by the article that we read. I want you to know that if you ever come back to Barcelona, we will remount the sign so you can take your picture. Isn't that nice? So I went back immediately. And the whole family came out. So this is Angel, who was the one who made the contact with me. And this is his father, who took over from the grandfather. And they still own the building, but they had to remove this, but they closed the studio because of digital photography. And they had to remove the sign because they were worried about theft, which is a common subject in Barcelona. So all they did was just pop it in and pop it out again. And while I was there, I found other great deco typography. And this was a very curious one. This was inside of a market, and one of my Barcelona friends who was with me translated the Catalan. They said, this basically means oxen remains. And that's sexy. And I managed to find some neon, and this is all called Modernista. They're Art Nouveau. And this is just something that I found on Instagram that I photographed for the book. But their use of mosaics and wrought iron is really quite something. This is this beautiful mosaic sign for what is now an optique, but it used to be, like they still left everything intact inside. And it used to be an art supply store. And these signs up here are quite amazing with all the stained glass as well. So they do have a great respect for what they have. And the other, they had so many monograms, especially in the neighborhood I was living in, which was very residential. The buildings were all built in the early 1900s, and that's where all the Gaudi buildings are. So I would just, every afternoon, when I had like an hour before the light was gone, I would just walk up and down and photograph all of these monograms. This is from a brewery, and I thought these were artichokes, but they're actually hops. And then the same thing with a lot of the buildings had the year that, and there was always something innovative done with that. And this is one of my favorite spreads of the book, just all the different ways you can do a number in wrought iron. Wrought iron, so they had to have a good sign. So, so from there, I started doing my own projects, like these a series of pencils based on my collection of Italian pencils from the 1930s. I always liked the double-sided pencils, which were usually done in red and blue for teachers to correct homework. But of course, red and black are my favorite colors, so I had to do that. And then I thought colored pencils would be a good idea, so I named them Tutti Frutti. And then Brillante, which are metallic colored pencils. And then I did something that I said I'd never do. Bill Moran asked me to do it. And how do you say no to him? And this was for the Hamilton Wood Type Museum as part of the Legacy Project. So I decided to do it in the style of an Italian futurist letter form that I always liked. And I actually got to see Martin, this longtime pantograph operator, actually cut the font out of wood. And I have this framed in my studio. And then we were able to do this series of posters that were printed in letterpress that they sell at the museum that you've probably seen, I guess, on pasta, antipasti, and dolci. And then right after that, I had a retrospective exhibition at the School of Visual Arts. And I had a staircase to deal with. We had to figure out some way of covering it up. So I decided I just needed 12 different pasta names of equal length that we could set in Mardel in black and red, of course. And then from there, we went on to Montecatini, which is based on the hand-lettered posters in the Stile Liberty period, which tended to have a lot of interesting ligatures that you see here. There are actually 200 different ligatures in the font. And then we went on to develop this further and make it into a family. So it's in different widths and weights as well. And then finally, Marseille, which is a French accented based on the letter forms that I used on the cover of The Lover, which I showed you way back in the beginning. So I think we've come full circle. Thank you. Do we have time, Bill?
We do have time. Let's open up the floor to questions if you're ready.
I'm ready.
Louise, we have one over here.
For the sign books, how did you decide which typography inspired the cover design?
Oh, the cover. The covers were very, very challenging every single time because every time I would try to base it on an existing sign in the book, and it just never looked right. So I always had to kind of invent something new. And they were really, really difficult and very, very time consuming. Like for the Italian one, do you want me to go back and show that since?
Sure.
We can just look at that. Because it started because there was a sign maker who I met in Rome who was doing this cutout metal kind of signage, very small signs. They were, like about this big. So I knew that it was not gonna, and I don't think he could work bigger than that. So, and I tried to about it. I showed him a sketch, and I asked him if he had an email address so I could email him a better sketch and more information about it. He didn't mail. Did he have a fax? No, but he had a friend who had a fax. So this is what we're dealing with. So I sent him, I actually snail mailed him the information. I also faxed it with a big note to the friend to send it on to him. Never heard from him again. And then the next year when I went back and passed by his shop, he was gone. So that's what happens to sign makers. So we had to figure out how to do this. And originally, so I drew it out and I wanted it to look the way those signs looked that he was making. But it had to be a little bit more refined than that. So my senior designer did this in Photoshop and it looked pretty good. But then we decided it didn't look real. It looked real, but it didn't look real enough. So we ended up having it cut out of, it was laser cut out of plexi, and then it was spray painted silver. And then we put the red paper and the black paper behind it. And then we photographed it. So it was quite a process. But I'm glad we did it.
Other questions? We got one over here. Lisa now?
What is it that like you're looking for, like when you're like roaming the streets and looking for signs? Like what is it that jumps out at you, tells
What
you
am I looking for when I'm
that they're important, that need to be like documented? Should I say that?
unfortunately, I'm having a little trouble hearing every word, so I'm getting about every other word. But are you asking what am I looking for when I'm walking on the street looking for a good sign?
Yes, that was the question.
Okay, good. If not, I'll just make up the question. Well, I love finding the signs on Google Street View, but there's nothing like finding it in person, and very often I'm just, because what I used to do is every time I went to Italy, I would always go to a town I had never been to before just to document the signage. And I would never know what to expect, but a lot of times you sort of get, you kind of get used to knowing when you're going to pounce on something really great. And it's usually, after you go through the center of town, you find a couple of good signs, and then it starts getting boring. And what happens in some of these towns is, I was in this town this summer, Rovereto, where the DePero Museum is, which is well worth the trip. But they only had a couple of good signs, and the rest of it was really boring. And then I found out that the part of the town was bombed in World War II, so that can be a problem. But very often, just when I'm walking around, sometimes I can just feel it, that there's going to be a great sign around the corner. And that's why I have to just go up and down every street, because you just never know. No, it could be that doesn't have to enter, but it's worth it.
Thanks. Got one more question here.
Did doing these signs, like going out and looking at these signs, did that radically shift your designs from before you were looking at these signs to after? That makes sense?
Okay, I missed some of that. Did it shift your
graphic design work before these books?
My own work?
Yes.
To change my own work? That's an interesting question. I don't think it shifted it. I think it probably honed in on what I was really interested in, which I guess makes sense, because it was after I did these books that I started designing typefaces, which I never wanted to do before. But this made me want to do it, and maybe part of it was because of all those backwards A's that were driving Z. But you know, the thing I love about signage is that it's so unpredictable. It's not like a font, you know, it's much more creative. And also seeing how every town had its own kind of signage vocabulary that nobody else seemed to have. And that's something that I'm always striving for, because I never like to repeat myself in my design. So I think it all sort of came together in its own peculiar way.
Cool. Louise, I'm going to close out with one last question, and it was something that came up with the students before you came online, and that is, we were talking about the difference between the word nostalgia versus being a historian. Do you put yourself in one category or the other?
Ooh, no, I don't. Historian is much too serious. And nostalgia sounds just kind of cheesy. It's like, I also don't like the word retro. That was a big, retro was used a lot, I think, in the 90s, and it was just like, no. I don't know what word I want to be labeled by. Maybe I don't want a label.
That's a good answer. Thank you so much for your time. This was exquisite.
Thank all of you. You're a very good audience. And I'm
We'll
sorry.
be in touch soon.